You could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. All eyes were on Michael Franzese. This man was known as the Mafia's most charming member. In fact, many people said he had a disarming smile that could melt glaciers. But today, his grin didn't reach his eyes. Instead, it was clear that the famous mobster was hiding something behind that infamous smile. As the prosecutor spoke, Franzese tried to remain impassive. The truth was, he wasn't worried about going to prison for the rest of his life. He knew he wouldn't end up there. Why? Because this man had a secret that would save him from spending the rest of his days behind bars. It all started when he was arrested. As the men in black led him out of the courthouse, a reporter yelled, "Michael, do you have anything to say?" This question caught Franzese off guard. For a split second, he considered staying silent. However, that disarming smile crept back onto his face. "Not at this time," he said with a wink. "I have nothing to say," and then he was gone. His cunning ways had earned him the nickname Don Mike. After all, he looked like a wealthy businessman, not a common mobster, so no one thought twice when he traveled back and forth across state lines. What they didn't know was that each trip was carefully planned and executed. When news broke that the FBI was looking for Franzese, everyone was stunned. They believed the authorities had him surrounded. But he slipped out of their fingers once again. Where was he? Well, he was living under an alias in Hollywood. And he wasn't alone. He had company in the form of 2 hitmen. Authorities tracked him down and placed him under house arrest. But even then, Franzese was one step ahead of him. He bribed a maid with 20 grand to let him use her phone. It's how he made contact with his crew who helped smuggle him out of the country. He went on the run for years until he finally returned to New York. There, he turned himself into the authorities. Soon as he did so, they took him to a secret location where they interrogated him. They wanted to know everything about the Mafia. Why? Because Michael Franzese was a treasure trove of information. He'd spent years climbing the ranks of the Bonanno crime family. In fact, he was once close personal friends with boss Philip Rusty Rustelli. This meant he knew every dirty little secret the Mafia had been hiding. But there was a problem. While Franzese agreed to cooperate, he also had a lot of pride. He didn't want to be seen as a rat. How could he make sure the other mobsters didn't find out what he'd done? Well, he came up with a clever plan. He told the FBI everything about the Mafia, but he also gave them false information. This way, if word got out that he'd become an informant, no one would take the false details seriously. In fact, it would make him seem crazy. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of getting sentenced right away, Franzese was released without any charges. What? Why? Well, the authorities decided to keep him alive. That's because they intended to use him to bring down the rest of the Mafia, however. Franzese knew that if he stayed in the witness protection program, he'd be stuck in a boring life forever. So he came up with a daring plan. He wrote a tell-all book called Blood and Betrayal. It detailed the secrets of the Mafia and how he'd managed to evade the authorities for so long. Unsurprisingly, the book became an instant bestseller. It had everything the public wanted to know about the inner workings of the Mafia, and while the authorities hated that he'd exposed even more secrets, they couldn't deny that he'd successfully taken down several mobsters by spilling the beans, so they let him go. But being a former Mafia captain wasn't easy to leave behind. Although Franzese promised to never return to his old ways, he found himself slipping back into his old habits. How could he resist the allure of the Mafia? Well, he couldn't. And before long, he was back in prison. That should have been the end of the story. After all, he'd betrayed his own kind and given up all their secrets. Surely the mob would never forgive him. But Franzese had another trick up his sleeve. He was already a celebrity by this point. He appeared on talk shows, played himself in movies, and even hosted his own radio show. In other words, he was untouchable. No one would risk taking out a former Mafia captain who had so much notoriety. In fact, killing him would have caused chaos within the Mafia and drawn unwanted attention from the authorities. So Franzese was safe, or so he thought. The truth was, the Mafia had never forgotten about him, and now they had the perfect opportunity to get rid of him. It happened during a routine traffic stop. 2 officers approached Franzese's car, but they weren't interested in his license or registration. Instead, one of them pulled out a gun and shot Franzese in the head. Luckily, he survived and was able to identify the gunman. It was none other than Matthew Madonna. Madonna was the nephew of a Bonanno crime family capo, and he'd been sent to kill Franzese. That Why? Well, after years on the run, Franzese had become a liability. If he kept talking, more and more members of the Mafia would be brought down. And that's why Madonna had been hired to silence him. The trial began, and the entire country was watching. Everyone wanted to see how the justice system would handle such a high-profile case, but no one was prepared for what happened next. During the trial, it became clear that Madonna acted alone. While several mobsters testified against him, others remained silent. It seemed as though the Mafia had lost its power. But then, Franzese dropped a bombshell. He claimed that the Mafia was still alive and well, and that the only reason he survived the hit was because the other mobsters didn't want the heat. In other words, they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. Everyone gasped. Could this be true? Was the Mafia still running around pulling strings from the shadows? Well, the jury didn't believe Franzese, so they found Madonna guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. And although the Mafia was disappointed that their secret had been revealed, they weren't too worried. After all, they'd been operating in the shadows for decades. A few extra precautions wouldn't hurt. However, Franzese knew that he'd won. Even if no one believed him, the damage was already done. The authorities would now be watching the Mafia's every move. And while they might not have found any concrete evidence, they knew that the old ways of doing things was coming to an end. So who was right? Was the Mafia still lurking in the shadows, or was it truly finished? Well, the truth is somewhere in between. While the Bonanno crime family was broken up, other families were still thriving. In fact, they'd just changed their tactics. Today, the Mafia operates on a smaller scale. They don't control the entire country, but they still have a strong presence in certain parts of America. What's more, they've learned from their mistakes. The Genovese crime family, for example, has a strict rule against becoming celebrities. That's why you won't find any mobsters spilling their secrets to the media. Instead, the Mafia has gone underground in every sense of the word. They deal with drugs, extortion, gambling, and human trafficking. But they do it all behind closed doors. So while the era of flashy mobsters is over, their presence is still felt in society today. Now, check out Who Was the Real Boss of the Mafia, or watch